In area probability sampling, a partial list is constructed by selecting counties, then municipalities, then census tracts, and then blocks, but for only a few hundred locations rather than for every block in the entire country. There is, again, no good list for all of that. After blocks are selected, a complete list of those blocks is constructed by having an interviewer actually walk the blocks and make a complete list of each housing unit. The sample elements are then selected from that list, but we never have to list every housing unit in the entire country, just those in the blocks selected by this multi-stage area probability procedure. So again, a procedure results ultimately in a sampling frame, which in this case is a list, but it's only a partial list of all households in the country. Sampling frames, like sample populations, are rarely perfectly specified. People move, die, they're born all the time, so the population is an ever-shifting target. Even with voter lists, which are registered voters, for example, some have moved or died, and there are often new voters who are not added to the list at the time the list was acquired. So as a sampling frame, they may be omitted, and other people may register by election day but weren't registered at the time that the sampling frame was constructed. And so that sampling frame is incomplete, and it contains elements that aren't really supposed to be in it, and that's inevitable. Even in the case of the certiorari petitions, where you might think the Supreme Court would keep pretty good records of those, it's possible that the petition list contains errors, possibly of omission, or possibly duplication. Maybe maybe one person submits multiple petitions, for example, or maybe some petitions for some reason are left out of the listing. Serious sampling statisticians admit these flaws while doing everything they possibly can to clean the sampling frame as well as possible before selecting the sample. In this, sampling statisticians are both obsessive about detail, but also realistic that imperfection is inescapable. The imperfections may not matter much for some purposes, though they might for others. For example, about 2% of U.S. households have no telephone, and so they're missed from telephone surveys. But for a sample of the general adult population, just that 2% cannot have much impact on estimates of the full population simply because it's a tiny fraction of the whole. Even if the percentage without telephones were dramatically different from the whole population in, say, their preference for president, they represent such a small fraction they wouldn't shift our estimate very much. But suppose we had a different purpose. Suppose we wanted to do a survey of Americans living in poverty. Then we might expect those households without phones to be considerably different and have a considerably higher rate of non-phone households. That would raise questions as to whether a phone survey would be adequate coverage of the target population of households in poverty. So what may be an adequate frame for one purpose becomes an inadequate frame for another purpose. Finally, frames that are adequate for one period of time may change in their adequacy over time. The most currently pressing example of this are cell phone-only households, which is a very important example of undercoverage. Until 2000 or early 2008, most national telephone polls included only landline households within the sampling frame, thus undercovering, that is to say omitting entirely, the cell phone-only population, which was in 2007 and early 2008 about 16% of all U.S. households. There had been continuing study of the cell phone-only population for more than a decade, And those studies had shown that while 16% is considerable under coverage, the political attitudes and vote choices of the cell-only population was not markedly different from that of the landline population. Because of that, omitting the cell-only population did not produce a substantial bias in estimates for the entire population. Let's do a quick calculation to show this. Suppose that among the landline population, opinion is, say, 60% in favor of some policy, while in the cell-only population, only 50% favor that policy. Now, a 10% gap is a pretty big gap between groups. What would the total population opinion be? Well, it would be 0.84, the percentage with landlines, times 60%, the support in the landline group, plus 0.16, the size of the cell-only, times the 50% support among cell-only households. Do the multiplication and you get 58.4% as the true opinion in the entire population, both landline and cell-only. But if we did only a landline survey, we'd get 60% in favor instead of 58.4%. Now there's a little bit of a difference there, but given that the typical national survey has about a plus or minus 3% margin of error, this small underestimate of 1.6% seems unlikely to result in a serious error about the full population, even though we omit 16% with cells only. And this is actually an extreme example because on most measures the gap between landline and cell only is smaller than the 10-point margin that I made it here for this example. So prior to 2008, most pollsters chose to accept significant undercoverage by sticking to landline households only, because calls were much more cost-effective with them, and the added costs of including cell phones didn't seem worth it when the effect was as minimal as it seemed to be. By the middle of 2008, however, cell phone-only households had grown to about 20% of the U.S., and for the first time, studies began to show small but detectable differences in population estimates using only landline and those that included a cell component. These differences were not huge, typically on the order of only about 2 or 2.5, 3%. So they were not gigantic differences, but they did start to appear in important variables such as vote preference for president. Also, they didn't appear for every variable, but only some. And so the case for including cell phone only had become more worrisome, though not yet overwhelming. Nevertheless, most pollsters in 2008 decided it was now an important enough effect that they changed their sampling frame to include cell-only households. Now, this was a costly step because cell phone-only calls have to be dialed by hand by a human instead of by a computer. And so they cost as much as 10 times more than a landline call does. Nevertheless, today virtually all national polls include a cell-only component within the sampling frame. That cell-only component may pick up 100 to 150 respondents out of a typical sample of around 1,000. But that reduces the amount of undercoverage in the sampling frame, which has been growing, and certainly we expect the cell-only population to do nothing but continue to grow. This presents a major challenge for not really the technology of sampling, because we do know how to sample the cell-only population, but it does drive up survey costs in a very important way, which, unless federal regulation of telephone service changes, will still prevent machine dialing of phone numbers, cell phone only cell numbers.